and this is the wrong word, but I am impressed when the pastor gets up to read his text and he doesn't need to look down at it. He's able to just give it to me from memory. That tells me he spent a lot of time in this text, and that it's close to his heart, close enough that he's memorized it. So if you can remember the text, maybe your people can too. And I got to the point where if I had a brief text, I would do it in sections and have the people speak the text back to me as I announced the text for the sermon. And you break it into 5 or 6 sessions, and they come back. And then during the sermon, I take a part of the text, and they do the same thing with me. But I was huge on memorization when I was a parish pastor, and that helps the people remember. It seems to me one of our goals ought to be that they remember the text of the sermon, not just the sermon, but the text of the sermon. And a way to do that is to help them memorize, especially the briefer texts during the delivery of the sermon. Yeah.
Did you ever find it helpful to have some sort of way of bringing the text to them in the week prior?
Oh yeah. One of my complaints is you'll visit. I used to visit a lot of churches, as Chris does, on weekends, and you'd see in their bulletin, when they still had bulletins, all of this month's Lutheran Hour sermons, texts, and topics. And then there's nothing in the bulletin about next week's sermon by your pastor, what he's going to be doing. So, yeah, they should have the readings ahead of time. A lot of churches will put the readings for the week in their weekly newsletter. Many churches are doing weekly newsletters now online, or in monthly newsletters. They can have them ahead of time. And then the pastor needs to encourage people to read those texts before. I talked about this dynamic listening workshop I do for lay people. It's one of the things we help lay people develop a way to read those lessons before they come to church on Sunday. And then if they haven't, to have something available to them in the pew to actually look at those lessons. That's more difficult now because a lot of churches aren't doing service folders anymore. It's all up on the screen.
I sort of accidentally discovered that the Thursday daily devotion for Lutheran Hour Ministries is always the gospel of the next Sunday.
Yeah.
And so I've been sharing that.
That's cool. That's good. Yes?
What about emailing the text, or not just the text, but the whole sermon? Emailing it out to the members, is that good or not so good?
Well, certainly online you'll see a lot of preachers that actually have a little 2-minute tease for their coming sermon. That's a great idea. I would want to mail my sermon manuscript out ahead of time.
I guess so. Church.
Yeah, exactly. And I still buy Fred Craddock's thing every sermon. I have a cat out of the bag. He has this inverted triangle that you start wide and you get down to that one major thought, and often it's a surprising thought. That's Fred Craddock, who started the whole narrative preaching thing with that. But I like the idea of there being a surprise to a sermon, so I don't want to give him too much, but I do like the idea of the tease. Do any of you do that? Do you get something out ahead of time? Okay, that's good. So I just wanted to review this a little bit. I'm committed. What I love about my LCMS background is that we were taught to be textual preachers, but I think this pushes it even farther, that every aspect of our preaching should be driven by the text. That makes us more than expository preachers. That says, as soon as, out of the gate, so to speak, we're in the text as we prepare. All right. Watch my time. Little open conversation here for a little bit. Take the 23rd Psalm, and we're talking about timeless preaching. Just mind that psalm from memory. That's one thing that we do have memorized, so that's why I chose it. What timeless truths can you just spit out that are there in Psalm 23? Timeless truths.
Walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will be with you.
Okay, and put that into your own words.
When I come to the point of death, I don't have to fear, be afraid.
Great, super. All right, another one. That's timeless, right? That worked for your grandparents and it works for you. Yeah.
All
dwell in the house of the Lord forever. I believe in the resurrection of the body and the life everlasting.
Okay, great, good. Please.
God's provision for all of our life.
God's provision for all of our lives. Very much a shepherd concept. Yeah. Somebody else. Yeah.
Goodness and mercy will pursue me, run me down, and take me.
Did a little work on the Hebrew word there. Yeah.
Yeah, that Hebrew word, everybody just says follow. It's not follow.
Yeah.
Run you down.
I have this memory of running down a sheep again, and I'm thinking, it's back there again. It keeps coming back. Yeah, go ahead.
In the presence of my enemies, in the foxhole with enemies on every side, prepares a table for me.
That's really good. Really good. That's reminiscent of who told the story about being surrounded? Can't miss anybody. Yeah, that's right. I love that. Go ahead.
Rod and my staff, sheep are stupid.
Okay, so sometimes it's a rod, sometimes it's a staff. Yeah, good. All right. If you were asked to see the 23rd Psalm, if you were asked to give us picture language, what do you see in the 23rd Psalm? Yeah.
I've always envisioned a shepherd walking alongside the sheep, and then each one of those scriptures is like a stage of the sheep's life, where the shepherd is doing something different in each one. So when they're surrounded by enemies, he's setting the table. When they're in the valley of the shadow of death, he's there protecting them.
So a picture of the shepherd in whatever state the sheep might be, the shepherd's there. The shepherd's with the sheep in the presence. Yeah. Well, that's nice insight. Yeah. Another picture. Yeah.
I don't remember who did it, but it brings to mind the portrait of the children with the guardian angel standing over them as they're just going about their business on the precipice of a cliff.
Yeah.
And yet they're doing their thing, and the angel watching over them and keeping them safe in spite of the danger that is so close.
That's good. Yeah. So the shepherd's presence there again, even though the image of the sheep may be there totally they're munching on grass, while he's protecting them, kind of thing. Yeah, please.
I think you remember the old Windows 7 or Windows XP splash screen that came up. It was just this green hill. That was the pastures. Whenever I saw that, I thought that was
Yeah, good. Yeah, what you're doing now is what we're talking about in terms of timeless truth, but also with the timeless truth comes these timeless images. And isn't it interesting, to me it is at least, how in the world does the shepherd analog still work? I mean, who knows anything about herding sheep? Obviously I don't. So it's amazing that not only the timeless truth, but the timeless image is still there, and it's still working for us. We treasure it. It's what people want read at their funeral service, still, after all these centuries. Yeah.
One thing that was kind of stuck in my head for some reason. I saw this YouTube video of a sheep that was stuck in a narrow ditch. You guys see that? And the guy rescues the sheep out of there. It bounds off and then falls right back into the ditch. And it's got stuck again. So what's stuck in my head is how clueless we are.
Yeah.
It's like
I saw that with the caption like, "Me after Jesus forgives my sins."
That's good. All right. I love this conversation. I have to watch myself because I have a lot to present here yet. But what makes a sermon ugly? I thought if we're going to talk about timeless truth, timeless beauty, and truth and beauty belong together, don't they? Truth and beauty. And by the way, the third one that belongs there is goodness, and that's certainly in Psalm 23 too. But when we talk about a beautiful sermon, which I chose to title the book "Beautiful Sermon," I'm curious what you think would make an ugly sermon. Chris, you're pretty quick on this one.
When the light is in the wrong place, it needs to be on Jesus Christ. He's the Savior, and not on me. It's not about me. It's not about my stories. It's got to be on Christ. But we can use it in an illustrative, to illustrate. We can do that for ourselves. But you got to pull off.
So when the light is too much on the preacher and the light isn't on Christ and the gospel,
Right.
that makes the sermon ugly. Yeah, it's good. Yeah.
An illustration I heard years ago, a pastor saying that you should get the Jesus disease, be infected by him. And that to me was a very ugly way of presenting the gospel.
Say that again. I'm not sure.
You need to be infected with Jesus. You need the Jesus disease.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So I remember a lady coming out of church at a wedding and saying, "Boy, you use the J word a lot around here." The Jesus word. Yeah. But it was noticeable to her that the church she attended didn't have the Jesus infection very much. Yeah, please.
One of my favorite sermons that I've ever heard actually used ugly very well. And she'll be little brother-in-law who we mentioned. He started out the sermon literally 10 minutes, just hammering the congregation on law and legalism. And everybody's sitting back, oh my goodness, what is this? Where is he coming from? And then there was a long pause and he goes, you don't like that, do you? And then he moved into the gospel. It was one of the most wonderful sermons I've ever heard. I'm getting goosebumps there.
All right. Please.
Multiple endings.
Yeah.
Just when you think it. All of a sudden, starts back up again.
Yeah. Four finalies.
You're right.
Finally.
Finally.
Actually, I think Paul, the Apostle Paul, is guilty of that a little bit, where you think he's done and he isn't done yet. But he was inspired. We're not, you know. Yeah.
I think a sermon can get really ugly when it forgets what it's trying to do or how it's trying to do it. And I think the structures help with that a lot. Where you have sermons that will start out trying to move along the text, but then there's an illustration, and they get distracted. And now they're trying to do a narrative sermon. And then they remember, oh, it's about the text, and they pull in a gospel handle, and they're on another text, and by the end of it, I don't know what sermon I heard.
Okay. That's chaos and confusion, isn't it? That makes a sermon ugly. If it's not structured well, you don't stay with the text. Yeah. All right. Well, let's move into some talk about aspects of timeless preaching. I listed some of those. Timeless God. God doesn't change, so that we always have an eternal God to present. I'm going to claim, as I do in the book, that if you're going to have a beautiful sermon, it needs to be beautiful in the fact that the focus is on what God is doing, what God is saying. So that God makes a sermon beautiful. That may go down hard for you because you'd like to think you make a sermon beautiful. But we'll talk about that. You do in a way, but it's really God who makes the sermon beautiful because God is timeless and God is full of glory, full of splendor, full of mystery. So there's the timelessness of God. There's also the timeless text. It's just so moving to me sometimes to think about how these texts have survived and how the church works so hard to make sure that we have a text that's as true can be in terms of its integrity as a text. It's fun to talk to Jeff Klola, who's now at the Bible Museum in Washington, whose specialty is textual criticism and textual preservation. He tells an amazing story of certain texts in the scriptures, the work that went into keeping those texts alive for us and keeping the timeless word still with us. There is this sense that I don't know if Lutherans have it as much as maybe some other Christian traditions, but a sense of awe at the word, that I get to preach this word that was preached in the 4th century, in the 9th century, the same scripture text. So the timeless text, to me, is something to celebrate. The timeless sacred story, we haven't talked much about this. I'm going to talk more about this with the teachers later today. But the whole concept of needing a sacred story, which is different from your story, your personal history. But I think the buzzword for this is meta-narrative or worldview. But but that we're a part of a story that spans time, that's bigger than time, and to claim one's place in that story, that the story of Jesus is my story. That's different than my story grew up here in Chicago and when this happened and so forth. That's important. And only you can tell that story, your story. And your story needs to be heard and told. But the more significant story is finding your place in the Jesus story. That's the sacred history of God's people. And so it ends up being a story that's timeless, but also it's a corporate story. It's not necessarily an I and me story, it's a we story. Again, I think we're at a point in time where this concept of a shared sacred story is really important. I think we should be preaching to community, preaching to we and our and us in this time. And I think we're in danger even more now of an individualized faith that doesn't have a sense of body of Christ, holy Christian church concept. Timeless truth, the truths that we shared, you shared some of those out of the 23rd Psalm that are still there and still communicable, still able to be transferred from one person to another and kept true with faithfulness. Timeless goodness, the application of the text, the living out of our faith, loving the neighbor, it's been there throughout the life and tradition of the church. That doesn't change. And what I landed on, because there was just nothing there in Lutheran theology, as my favorite timeless focus is timeless beauty. You don't find Luther talking very much about beauty, even though he immersed himself in beauty, in terms of the beauty of music, the beauty of the written word, the beauty of poetry. He understood lyrics pretty well. I think that A Mighty Fortress lyric is pretty good. That'll probably last a while. So he was immersed in beauty himself. The closest he gets, and I forget the guy who did the book, I was with him on Luther's Understanding of Beauty. Anybody read that book? I can't remember his name, but he tries to find in Luther something that deals with aesthetics, and the best he can come up with, and I think it's pretty accurate, is that for Luther, there is no beauty for us to discover apart from the gospel of Jesus Christ. We are just an ugly sinner with ugliness in our lives apart from the gospel that opens us up to a whole world of beauty in Jesus Christ. I like that understanding of Luther. He's got plenty of Luther quotes to support that. He spoke at the symposium. Yes, please.
You know, I was thinking about Luther's Bible, and I don't know much about it. Did he get a chance to select any woodcuts or anything for that edition of the Bible?
You know, I don't know the history of those woodcuts, but he definitely wanted illustrations for lay people, because the Bible, as we all know, was written with lay people, not written, translated with lay people in mind. I don't know how the woodcuts were chosen, but they're there in the earliest versions of. There were some versions of German scripture out already, as most of us know, that were not illustrated very well. But the German Bible that came out after Luther's translation is replete with wonderful woodcuts. And I'm sorry, I don't know a lot of the history of those. That's a good subject for study, no doubt. Somebody probably did a PhD dissertation on those woodcuts. Yeah. All right. So a lot to look at in terms of timeless preaching, and it's all over the place in our preaching, but I'm going to try to focus mostly on the timeless beauty that's there in preaching. That said, it seems to me there's no question that we preach timeless truth with timeless beauty in a timely context. And that was some of the difficulty I had with the assignment about timeless preaching, that it could be that timeless preaching means that people hear the same thing over and over again, in that the preaching I started out with in 1973 with my ordination is just like my preaching now. It's the same as it's always been. Well, no, it isn't, thankfully. Have you read any of your first sermons? You probably have, Jake, because you just gave them. But but I went back. You're going to be doing this probably after you retire, plowing through all the boxes of stuff. I had probably 4 boxes of hard copy sermons. I started reading through those first 3 years, and I was like Mr. Wannabe Theologian. I mean, I was using highfalutin nouns like systematicians use. I'm sure people were thinking, who is this kid and what does he think he's doing? My style changed dramatically over the years. So timeless preaching doesn't mean it's always the same. We preach contextually, and the context is going to impact our preaching, but the timeless truth is still there, delivered in a different and probably more appropriate way. So much plays into this. We've talked a lot about the culture here, the culture impacting my preaching, but also my preaching addressing the culture. And it's no fair to bash the culture, I would maintain, because the culture is right there in the people you're preaching to. They bring it through the doors. So you don't get to bash the culture and leave your people feeling really holy, really separate, because they embody the culture in many ways. So, you know, the best stuff that's been written on this whole concept of aliens in a strange land, I think Walter Brueggemann, I'm not crazy about all of his exegesis, but do you know Walt Brueggemann at all? Have you read anything? He's the first guy to recognize this time as a time of exiles. We are the exiles of Babylon. He's the guy who made the first connection back in the 70s. And he's written several books on this. But what he raises up for us is how they don't know our language. They don't know our songs. The culture, they don't know our disciplines. They don't know our community. They don't know our future, our promises. So it's amazing when you look at how Brueggemann frames the culture, how much work we have to do, how much work we have to do in presenting a law and a gospel that really speak to our culture. Secondly, the language has changed. My language has obviously changed a lot from when I started preaching with a lot of systematic language, doctrinal language, because I grew up with a very doctrinal preacher, to very conversational, very analogy, image-laden preaching. So our language changes. Pastoral care is a context, I'm going to push that again, for our preaching. I had a nice conversation with one of you about that, and you properly reminded me, that you have to be careful. You don't mean that I'm going to have a pastoral care appointment with somebody on Thursday night, you're going to make it into the sermon on Sunday. And I'm going to try to, you didn't say that, I'm putting words in your mouth, but, and then I'm going to try to camouflage that person. Good luck with that in your congregation. I had somebody in my office, they were recently divorced, I won't mention their name. So that's not what we're talking about, but it's the ebb and flow of what you're hearing, what you're listening to as you visit with people, and that shapes a sermon. It makes a sermon different in some way and more pointed for people. So again, I'm looking for the guy, and I want it to be an LCMS guy in Synod who's going to write that book, because that book needs to be written. How do I wed pastoral care to preaching, because it's a context for my preaching that I have to pay attention to. Then there's a preacher's moment. You can't tell me that the moment in your life, what you've gone through during the week, isn't going to impact what you're going to say on Saturday or Sunday. So to know what's going on in your life, and people want to know what's going on in your life. Not that the spotlight falls on you, but as you talk about what you're going through in your life or what you experienced, the best illustrations are always the ones I think that the pastor has experienced firsthand. And I used to walk around with a notepad because there were so many things happening to me. I wanted to keep track of them and not forget them. So that what goes on in your life is important, but also in the hearer's moment, what they bring to church that Sunday. And Billy Graham's whole thing about reading the newspaper alongside the Bible is really good advice. You better not miss some major event that's happening in people's lives. They're waiting to hear something current from you, and especially if it's big time news that you're responsible to bring God's word to bear on. So as I thought about this, I'm a big Claude Monet fan, and you're probably familiar with some of his haystacks painting. This one recently sold for $110 million. So he's still doing fairly well. He's an artist you want to watch. But his haystacks or grain stacks, a famous set of, we don't know how many there are. We know of 25. Now these were all painted during the seasons of 1890 to 1891. Right outside his door, he had these haystacks, the same haystacks, and he painted them in different ways depending on the season of the year. So here's a few of them. By the way, the museum that has the most of these is the Art Institute of Chicago. It's the 8 or 9 of the haystacks. But it should be Claude Monet. He made them into a clause there. Haystacks at the National Gallery of Australia. And here's in the winter with the white frost effect. I gave you where the museums are as well. Here's one at Minneapolis Institute of Arts, my favorite museum. And again, in the snow and in the winter, the haystacks, they're outside his home in Giverny, France. As I thought about Monet's haystacks, I thought about our preaching. And it's very much like this. The haystacks didn't change. The same haystacks over and over again. His kids would run his pallets out for him to quick get the paint before the sun goes down, kind of thing. But what was going on around them, the climate, the weather, the snow, the sun, that changed. So those haystacks have become timeless in terms of the world of art. But when you look at them, you realize that what was different was the culture, was the environment in which those haystacks were. And that's what I'm trying to say in terms of the timelessness of preaching. Our texts are the same, for heaven's sakes, they're the same texts that have been preached, even on those same Sundays for centuries. And yet, they change with what you're experiencing in your life, they change with the context of the congregation. And there's a beauty to that it's both timeless and timely, and needs to be that way. So the truths don't change, they're timeless. But in a sense, the beauty of those truths change with our experience, with the time that we get to preach in. Does that make sense? I just find this to be a helpful analog for me. The same haystacks looking very different, but still the same haystacks. The same texts, same truths, but different from sermon to sermon, from year to year.
Dean?
Yeah.
Just the one thing that strikes me about it is you're looking at a stack of food.
Yeah.
It's the constant that people come for every week. That's what remains while the circumstance, the culture around it changes. It's the same meal that is offered to sustain the flock or the group. Yeah.
You added another layer to the analogy. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, it's food.
And on any given Sunday, the same text is being preached, but everybody's bringing their own surrounding at that particular moment. It was a death in his family.
Yeah, we talk about the culture. Actually, it's a myriad of cultures that are being brought into it. Yeah. Please.
And this is why you can't fish an old sermon out of the bucket and try to preach it. The whole environment has changed, even from from the fairly recent past. It just doesn't work, you know?
Yeah, I could never do that. I know guys do that. Peter Marshall, who I mentioned, I loved his preaching in the 40s and 50s before I was even around, but he would re-preach sermons. He did one every year. I could never do that. I picked it up, it was old for me, and I think it's going to be old for them.
But also, if things are changing so rapidly,
Yeah,
I think that feeds into it.
That's a good point. Yes, please.
One of the challenges in our culture that we face is that people don't believe in timelessness.
Yeah.
Especially in the university town where I serve, or Penn State, probably Ithaca, Cornell, or Rockford serves. There's a sense that we know everything new is better, but we know better than the past. And to get people to see that the human condition hasn't changed one iota. And so the application of Scripture is absolutely applicable today.
Yeah.
It's a very important starting point.
Yeah, and I think the church is one of the few places, at least in, I would say in most Christian churches, there's this sense of timelessness. We're dealing with eternal treasures here, but outside of church, there's not a lot of that.
It's like the latest technology. We're smarter, better, we know better than all the past.
Yeah.
It's all the new that's good. The other thing I think is contextually, there's some things in a university town that get pushed to the forefront that might not be pushed in other places. The pastors in my local area, State College, where Penn State's at, we all talk about the trifecta of things that have affected the church radically in our community. One is the pandemic, which you had up there, but racial issues to the nth degree in a university town. And also political ramped up. That's probably in other places too, but political ramped up to the nth degree. So all those things are contextual there, but there's a timelessness that we can bring to
That's
that.
good. That's good. Yeah, thank you. Yes?
Well, I was thinking about something Jordan Cooper said in his presentation about the difference between millennials and then Gen Zers, in that millennials are the ones that carry a lot of, partially I think because of deconstructionism, right, is driving a lot of what you're describing, that like, all of the stuff we currently have is the reason all the bad is going on, so we gotta break that down. But Gen Z doesn't have that baggage. And like, if the phenomenon of Jordan Peterson indicates anything, they're looking for the timeless stuff. Because if you break that stuff down to a certain degree, then there's nothing there.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where we're getting to. And so I think this is going to start to be very appealing to people because they're in need of it.
Good. I love that optimism. Yeah, yeah, good. All right, last comment for this. Yeah.
You know, sometimes I'm tempted to, because I've experienced something in a week, to bring that into the sermon. And I wonder what sort of filter do you use to say, that's too selfish or narcissistic or personal to really bring into the sermon? How do you decide what to include from your own experience from that week into a sermon versus saying, you've got to be more timeless than that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think on the one hand, you can use something out of your own personal experience, but you can also use something that you've read or something you've observed that's a little different than what you experienced personally. So there's a myriad of ways to use your experience in preaching. The rule has always been, number one, you don't let your personal story eclipse the text, but it really needs to illuminate the text. So it serves the text, you're sure of that. The other thing is, you don't go to either extreme. You never set yourself up as a paragon of virtue, right? So you need to be more like your pastor. You don't say that, but it sounds like that's what you're saying. And on the other hand, you don't want to be so revealing and vulnerable that people are out there thinking, why did we call this guy to be our pastor? You've said too much, and it's too personal, and it reflects poorly on not only you, but on the office. And I've heard that done, and it can be pretty devastating, not only to a sermon, but to a ministry. The guy starts kind of sharing too much of himself in the sermon. So I think most of us have a common sense of how far you take that, but the standard rule is it genuinely needs to illuminate the text. If it doesn't illuminate the text, don't share it. And back to President Wisher here, his comment that we never want to, what was your comment earlier?
About the light.
Yeah, that the light shines on the pastor more than it does on the
I think
text.
it's a stage.
Yeah.
A play.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. You probably knew all of that, but I restated it. All right, let's press on a little bit then. I wanted to also comment on just timeless gospel, timeless truth, timeless beauty, but changing homiletics. And so again, just to review quickly, in the last 50 years, we went from propositional truths, distilling a text down to 2 or 3 lessons from the text or truths from the text, to narrative preaching. And again, it started with Fred Craddock as one without authority in 1971. So it's like a 50th anniversary on narrative preaching. Is that right? 70? Yeah, 50 years. Craddock gave us narrative truths. Tied to that is the narrative platform that we talked about yesterday. And then the concern that some of our preaching has gone so narrative that we've lost truth. And that's something that comes through with Tom Long's book. And I think I gave you a long quote on this, which I will now read. This is just half of the quote. This is a big deal for me. If I put this much quote up on the screen, come on here. What has been for the last 30 years called narrative preaching is too often developed into a hodgepodge of sentimental pseudo-art, confused rhetorical strategies, and competing theological epistemologies. Preachers have larded sermons with silly stories of their pets and their children, told anecdotes from the playground to illustrate Golgotha, told hundreds of stories about certain kinds of people and shut out others, and crafted shifty trapdoor plots to keep the listeners amused. If the effect of the recent critiques is to burn away this kind of story stubble, then burn, baby, burn. Now see why I included the quote? Here's the second half. Faithful preaching is not story time. It is instead the spoken word at the epicenter of a community of courageous testimony. Boy, that sentence is so good. It is instead the spoken word at the epicenter of a community of courageous testimony. Such preaching models the vocabulary, the hospitable style of talking, the humility, the prayerful seeking, the awareness of ambiguity, the confident hope, and the gospel storied shape of the lives of people who will talk to their children about their faith and bear witness in the world to the overwhelming generosity of God. That is a tremendous statement that grows out of an overdone attempt to be narrative, and to the point where the narratives don't serve the text, they obscure the text, and that's the point. So what I'm trying to say is that realize that even though preaching is timeless, homiletics as a discipline is very much a changing discipline. We have nomenclature now for things like use of images, different structures for sermons that we never had 40 years ago. So we're actually developing nomenclature for the discipline of homiletics. It's changing, it's developing. And I think that's a good thing. But this brings us back to the kind of the basic truths that are necessary to truly make our preaching timeless. All right, so contemporary homiletics has generally ignored the role of beauty in the visual arts in preaching. I think that's fair to say. We haven't ignored truth. God knows LCMS preachers have tremendous respect for the truth of the scriptures. But the beauty that attends that truth probably has been missed by most of us, and certainly in the world of homiletics. You can find very little written on the beauty of preaching. The result is unintentional iconoclastic preaching. That's fresco from the 8th century of Byzantine iconoclasm where they destroyed the icons, and which he's doing right there. So we're not intentional iconoclasts, but we just haven't thought much about image in our preaching, or much about the beauty of that image, or we do accidental imagistic preaching. We're not sure what we're doing, but we saw this wonderful picture, and we're going to talk about that picture, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing. A theology of the cross may not be friendly toward an emphasis on the timeless beauty of preaching. I'm deciding whether I agree with what I wrote there or not. I think an emphasis on the beauty of God, the beauty of Christ, the beauty of the gospel, is an elevation of the faith that maybe takes us a bit too far from the theology of the cross where we want to be. So splendor, majesty, mystery, those big words. When we talk about the beauty of God, we usually refer to his Shekinah, his glory. So do we take beauty to a point where we're preaching a theology of glory? I'm working on this right in front of all of you. I'm working on
It's his glory.
yes, it's his glory. It's his glory. But we have a not an animosity, but an aversion to too much glory language in the LCMS. And I'm not sure that's good. Maybe that's my struggle. I think maybe we could use a little more glory language, but never set our cross down. Because now we're going to get pumped up with the glory of God.
But that's the glory. You know, to me, that's in John's gospel.
The glory of the cross. Glory of the cross.
But you're right. I think I used the word victory on a Monday night, and it was hard.
That says it. That's probably the struggle I'm having right in front of all of you is do I believe this or not? I don't know. But I so value the theology of the cross. I just think it's, when you look at what does Luther have to offer, vocation and theology of the cross, I put it right up there with salvation by grace through faith. I mean, that's huge. And we stand almost alone in that, it seems to be, in being a major sedes for our doctrine. Yeah.
Just that bullet item and wrestling with that sounds like a perfect sermon subject for Good Friday.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Because there's an ugliness and a beauty in that.
Yeah. Well, then finally, the beautiful preaching is timeless visual preaching. I'm convinced of that as we think visually and speak visually, there'll be more beauty to our preaching. When are we up here?
10:15.
10:15. Wow. I have about an hour's worth of material for you. We'll work through it. We'll move pretty quickly at this point. All right. I did that already. Do we find beauty in the preaching task, or does beauty find us? Trick question. Yeah. The answer is yes. We find beauty, and we work hard at finding beauty in a text, finding something we can see, something we can experience that swells our heart and have us aware that this is truly beautiful. We work hard at that, and at the same time, it finds us. So if you speak of rhetorical beauty, we've looked at Aristotle already, where when those three are in proportion, and that's an aesthetic word, when they're balanced in a rhetorical presentation like a sermon, it's a thing of beauty, and Aristotle talked about that. And Aquinas, 12th century, 13th century, he had the three elements of beauty as purity. Purity for him meant a wholeness, wholeness, a purity, proportion, that again, things related to one another in the right way, in the right amount, and clarity or color, that Paul himself, the Apostle Paul, prays for. So there's a rhetorical beauty that we work at, and some of us feel that we've been pushed in rhetoric in terms of sermons now to be more artists than craftsmen. I came through with Doc Kemmer. Thank God I had Doc Kemmer for my homiletics. And Kemmer pushed goal, melody, means, and we were pretty much craftsmen. That if we had a goal and melody and means in our sermons, we had a good sermon. I thought for the first 10 years that meant every sermon I preached had to have the first move goal, the second move melody, and the third means. Only to find out 10 years later, no, that's not what he meant. It just every sermon needs to have a dynamic of a goal and a melody and a means, and the means is always the gospel. So what's happened, I think, is we talk more now, hopefully we're going to see more about aesthetics in preaching. We're going to feel more like artists than, when I'm writing a sermon manuscript, I feel more like I'm writing poetry, and it's not poetry, not even close. But some of the same stuff going on in writing a poem, when I'm looking for a sermon structure, am I going to write the poem in iambic pentameter, or am I going to write it in Italian sonnet? I'm looking for a structure, which is much like poetry. So I found this helpful to say that as we work for rhetorical beauty, there's definitely going to be a sense of we finding beauty. On the other hand, beauty finds us. Sunrise in the Sea of Galilee, I was there my first visit in 1983, I think it was, to Israel. And I got up real early to take my picture on the Sea of Galilee and ran 20 shots of film out. If you don't know what film is, you don't know. I can ask somebody. So I'm out. I got beautiful shots of the Sea of Galilee. So I'm done with my camera. I don't have any film with me. And coming into the frame of my picture now, just with my eyes looking at it, is a Sea of Galilee fisherman on his boat. He's coming in and comes like he knows where my frame would have been. He stops right in the center, with the sun framing his silhouette. And he takes a net and throws it out across the Sea of Galilee. And I had no film. But I had one of the most treasured moments of my relationship with Jesus Christ on that Sea of Galilee. At that moment, when that net was in the sunlight and I felt like Jesus was ready to come walking on the water and throw his arms around me and say, so glad you came. So glad you're here. That was a watershed moment in my life because I was present. Not only was Jesus present with me, but I was present in that moment. And I set that doggone camera down and just was fed by that rich moment of the presence of Jesus Christ. That, I think, is so crucial. Does beauty find us or do we find it? Most often in preaching preparation, I think beauty has found me the way I was found in that experience on the Sea of Galilee. Well, here's what I spent an hour on at the symposium in St. Louis, and I now have 5 minutes. So these are what I think are key elements that give us a sense of beauty in the sermon. And they should be present in a sermon if you're after a sermon that could be called beautiful. So we'll go through them quickly. First, the beauty of God. That when I preach, there's a strong sense that what's happening in the sermon is God's doing. I challenge you, the next sermon you write, count the number of sentences in which God is in the subject. Is God the doer, or is Jesus, or the Spirit? But is God making things happen? God's the one who makes things happen in your sermons. And God's the one who runs the sentences of your sermons. So that the beauty of God is clear. throughout a sermon. There's the Rublev icon. Don't have much time to share with you, but the beauty of the icon, 15th century, is its proportion, the three persons of the Trinity, based on Genesis 18, the three visitors at the Oaks of Mamre. They look alike, they're proportioned the same. The Father wears the gold translucent robe, the Son wears the brown to emphasize his earthly time, and the Holy Spirit wears the green to emphasize the growth he brings. They all wear blue for their celestial divinity. The Father's mansion over his head, an oak of Mamre over the head of Christ to suggest the cross. But what I love about the icon, which icons so often do, is this invites you to join them at the table. There's a space for you. And there again, the presence of the preacher is so important in the presence of entering, in effect, the Trinity that the icon invites us to do. The beauty of the gospel, John Bigger's well-known painting, shotgun homes in Houston, Texas, they're still there. You stand on the front porch, shoot a shotgun, goes down the hallway, and runs down the middle of the house and goes out the back door. All the rooms are off the center hallway, so they call them shotgun homes. Well, here's a shotgun home community. The Third Ward is still there. And Biggers, who is a Christian, presents their church burning. You can see it in the upper left-hand corner. Everybody's watching the flames on the church except this one silhouetted figure who bears a lantern or a candle lantern. And he's already looking at what's next for this community. He's their spiritual leader. He's their pastor. And he's got the hope that we have a future despite the fact that the church is burning. That's the gospel of hope. That's so crucial. And to let that gospel shine as the predominant move of every sermon is crucial. It's what brings beauty to a sermon. I think we've covered those probably pretty well. Beauty of Christ. Again, so many images of Christ over the centuries. I love this image. These are sayings of Jesus that someone has shaped into an image of Christ. That I love it because it reminds us that Jesus in his word, where his word is, there he is as well. Just beautiful. Here's that Christ the Good Shepherd, 4th century, was found in the catacombs. And it's in really great shape, isn't it? Really beautiful. Here's Christ from one of the catacombs in Rome, haloed and bearded. The halo was the way that they began to suggest Christ's divinity. He was still depicted often in those early years as some sort of an emperor, if you know the icons, Pantocrata, or those icons. But here he's looking both human and divine, which was their struggle all the way through how to depict Jesus. Here's the humanity of Jesus on the cross. There at the Eisenheim altarpiece, where people were dying of terrible skin disease, Grünwald puts onto Jesus, bearing our infirmities to the cross, that same skin disease, the symptoms that were there in Eisenheim. I love that depiction of Christ on the cross. It's just amazing. And then this almost surreal image of Jesus looking like Jesus has never looked before that Caravaggio gives us. He was just a terrible person, Caravaggio, if you know anything about him. But boy, he was inspired when he gave us this Jesus who is just so different from any other depiction that you'll find anywhere of Christ. And again, the recently risen Jesus Christ, not necessarily right away recognizable by his disciples. So art gives us so many wonderful lessons about Christ that as we present him. I just challenge you to present a Christ that's living and real and present, and to use images of Christ even in your own language that help with that would be just super.
I don't have time to go through these. We've talked a lot about the beauty of the Word, the beauty of worship. This Thorvaldsen sculpture of Christ is all over the LCMS in the front of a lot of our churches. Any of you have this in your church? That's the Thorvaldsen sculpture. This is the church I grew up in. There's a remake of the Thorvaldsen sculpture right up front. I dropped a hymn book off this ledge when I was 12 years old. It hit a lady in the head, right? And she lived long enough for me on their 100th anniversary to apologize to her from the pulpit for hitting her head. But this place for me is home. It's now closed, the church, but there's still a worshiping community, and the church isn't LCMS. But that pulpit, 12 steps up from the back sacristy, on my confirmation day, my pastor took me up there and said, "Young man, someday you should be a pastor." And I thought that was an order, because this was Pastor Klein, and Pastor Klein was like Father, Son, Holy Spirit, Pastor Klein. I took that as a command almost, and from that day, I knew I was going to be a pastor. On my confirmation day, what is that? It's really, but it all happened in that space. These wonderful spaces, sacred spaces, that we call our own. This is our we call him the Minnesota Jesus because his hands look like mittens. We put that on the, as you go out of our sanctuary in Woodbury, Lutheran, there's sending Christ, sending you on your way, and actually that's what they call him now. People stop by to visit the church to see the Minnesota Jesus. And again, the beauty of worship is just preaching is worship, and it's fed by that whole wonderful liturgical context of the summits, some of the preaching, the summit of the Lord's Supper. It's just got to be there, and choirs. My gosh, the music. I loved how you surprised us by singing during the prayers. My guess is you've probably done that when you preach too. All of a sudden you're singing a hymn. Garrison Keeler was so great at this, you know, that you know who Garrison Keeler is? Okay. He would stand up and suddenly begin singing Beautiful Savior. We used to go to his Lake Wobegon thing all the time. And here's a bunch of people singing who don't even know each other, singing Beautiful Savior together. Try that sometime and watch how it works, the beauty of worship. And finally, the beauty of relationships. That ultimately, when you get up and preach, there's a convergence of relationships. Your relationship with your Lord, the relationship of the Lord with his people, your relationship with your people, theirs with you. It ends up being all about relationships, and as I said in retirement, the beauty of those relationships is what lingers for me. They are treasured relationships forever. Well, we don't have time to go through the rest of this. The beauty of head and heart engaged, that go for the heart, not just the head. That's a constant struggle for LCMS preachers, but it's there. There are the seven. I hope we at least touched on them enough that you got an idea of what they are. You should know the word ekphrasis. It's a word that is used for a description or explanation of a work of art. So you take an image and you explain it, or you write a poem to capture the meaning of the work of art. I think that's a lot of what we do in our preaching. We take the image of the text and try to put it into words. So ekphrasis is a word from speech that comes from a work of art, and it's really crucial. If we would have had time, I would have given you a taste of Van Gogh's preaching. I think I mentioned it to a couple of you that he did 25 versions of The Sower, and if you're ever looking for a wonderful piece of art where the sower is one with his field and the cycles of the seasons that you can see in the yellow above and the planting below, Here's the lost son. Max Beckman has him hiding in the upper right-hand corner. You have to look for him. Find Waldo, kind of thing. Here a depiction. Look at Picasso's Weeping Woman. I've used that on Ash Wednesday. Paints her emotions. Well, I think I'll stop there. Just to close, first of all, thank you for inviting me. This has been a joy to spend time. Let me just close with a real quick story. I'm sorry that I've gone over. Pastor Klein, who confirmed me and was a hero of mine, was ready to preach one Sunday morning and tucked his sermon manuscript into his suit coat pocket. In those days, the guys wore suit coats, and then on top of that, a Geneva gown. This is like going back, this was the 60s probably. And he died that morning before he could go out the door of the parsonage. He fell over dead, and they had his sermon manuscript. He had his sermon manuscript in his pocket. So they reached into his pocket and found the sermon manuscript, and scrawled across the top of his sermon manuscript was a single word in bold red letters with the title of the sermon, and it was Alleluia. So my hero pastor was the preacher who died with an Alleluia in his pocket. May the same be said of you. Thanks.